My name is Dani Rodrik. I'm the co-director of the Reimagining the Economy program here at the Kennedy School, along with Gordon Henson. And this is a kind of a new initiative where we're trying to sort of think of new policies for creating an inclusive economy. And we like to think of ourselves as a program with three different tools. We rely on three different kinds of knowledge. One of them is rigorous empirical research based at the local level to examine what kind of policies work and what don't. Secondly, the experiential knowledge of the practitioners, and we're bringing a lot of practitioners to learn from them as to what kind of a cross-sectoral programs tend to be more effective. And thirdly, the knowledge of social and political theorists who can enlighten us about different kinds of market economy and broaden our horizons about what kinds of alternatives are possible for an economy. And this is the second of our annual panels where we try to bring people for the second time in a row. Now it's an economist and a political philosopher. The first time our inaugural session actually featured Danielle Allen and Ed Glazer. And if you haven't seen that, you're interested in the video that's on our website. And today we're extremely lucky to have two scholars who have done really extraordinary work on issues that are at the core of our program. And in a very different kind of a way. Raj Chetty, who is an economist, has done extraordinary, creative, innovative work, very detailed work, highlighting and showing the importance of place and social networks in determining patterns of social mobility. Michael Sandel, a political philosopher, who has done very stimulating and for us economists, often very challenging work on the importance of civic virtue, community, and putting limits on the importance of markets in determining social value. So I'm very excited about this exchange. We're going to go until 4:30. The plan is that I'm going to give each of our speakers, beginning with Raj, 5 to 7 minutes to make some introductory comments. Raj will begin with talking about some of his recent work on the role of elite colleges in creating privilege and providing access to social mobility. Then Michael will take it from there, bringing in some of ideas from his new book that he will talk us a bit, and then we're going to have a kind of interchange and open it up for questions and discussions. So with that, Raj.
Right, well, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Dani, for having us here. Thank you all for joining. It's terrific to be a part of this group, and there are, I think, no more important issues to be discussing than those that are being discussed in the Reimagining the Economy program, and a pleasure to be here with Michael to discuss these topics. So as an economist, it's very difficult for me to talk without data and slides, so I'm going to start by showing you a couple of slides from our recent work to kind of help frame the conversation from my perspective, talking about issues of education, meritocracy, and economic opportunity, and then get into the discussion. So as Dani said, a lot of the work we've been doing in our research group at Harvard, Opportunity Insights, is to use granular data to zoom in to understand the roots of economic inequality at a very local level across institutions, across neighborhoods, and so forth. But to set the stage, I want to start at a much bigger picture level to think about how the American economy is evolving at a broad macroeconomic level by talking about the American dream, which is, of course, a multifaceted, complex concept that has different meanings to different people. But I want to distill it in this first chart here to one key aspect of the American dream, which is that we at least aspire to be a country where through hard work, any child has the chance to move up in the income distribution relative to their parents. Certainly it was this type of ideal that drew my own parents to come to this country and countless other immigrants. And so in this first chart here, I'm showing some data from a study my colleagues and I did a few years ago where we set about to assess the extent to which America actually lives up to that aspiration. by measuring the fraction of children who go on to earn more than their parents, measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s and adjusting for inflation, and looking at that statistic by the year in which the child was born. And what you can see is that for kids born in the middle of the last century, say back in 1940, for example, it was virtually a guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up. 92% of children born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did by our calculations. But if you looked at what has happened over time, you can see that there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in 1980, we're turning 30 around now when we're measuring their incomes as adults. It's become essentially a 50-50 shot, a coin flip as to whether you're going to achieve the American dream. So this trend is, of course, of great interest to economists like myself because it reflects a fundamental change in the economy that we'd like to understand. I would argue it's also fundamental social and political interest because, as Michael describes in his recent book and many others have discussed, these kinds of changes in our economy have led a lot of people to express frustration about this being a country where it's no longer easy to get ahead, even through hard work. And that, I think, is reflected in a number of recent political outcomes and so forth. So motivated by this broad trend, in our research group, we're interested in understanding what is driving the fading of the American dream and how we can create a more inclusive economy, create greater opportunities for upward mobility for everyone going forward. Today, I'm going to focus specifically on one aspect of what we think might be an important driver, which is access to higher education. I want to be clear that that's by no means the only important driver. There are many other factors that play into this, from social networks to neighborhood level factors to elementary education, but higher education is certainly one important domain. And so in the context of higher education, our team has been doing some work trying to understand at a granular level how much colleges individually and our higher education system as a whole is contributing to economic mobility. And so the way we've done that is by using very detailed data from tax records linked to records from the Department of Education and other sources that allow us to measure in a precise way every college's contribution to economic mobility. And let me just walk you through in this slide what we see in that sort of data and why I think it's a very powerful lens to study these issues in a more precise way. So in this plot, each college in America is represented by a different dot. And we're showing two key dimensions that determine how much any given college contributes to economic mobility. On the vertical axis is what we're calling the upward mobility rate. That is a statistic that measures among the kids who are from low-income families who attend a given college, say from the bottom fifth of the income distribution, what fraction reach the top fifth. And you can see on that dimension, colleges like Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and so on, highly selective private colleges, look terrific. The vast majority of students who attend these colleges, who come from low-income families, end up reaching the upper middle class or well beyond. However, a college's total contribution to economic mobility depends not just upon the degree of success of the low-income students who attend that college, but also on the number of low-income students you have to begin with. And on that dimension shown on the x-axis, the fraction of students who come from the bottom 20%, colleges like Harvard, Stanford, and Princeton, so forth, don't look so great. Only 3% of kids at Harvard come from the bottom 20%. To give you another statistic that kind of reveals the degree of inequality here, you're about 80 times more likely to attend Harvard if you come from the top 1% of the income distribution than the bottom fifth of the income distribution. So these universities, while they deliver terrific outcomes, are incredibly skewed towards kids from very high income families. And thus they just cannot mechanically be contributing a whole lot to social mobility simply because they don't enroll that many kids from low-income families. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, you'll notice that there are lots of dots over here, a lot of colleges that do have many low-income students. But unfortunately, if you look at the outcomes at those colleges, those kids don't achieve a very high level of upward mobility even after attending those institutions, typically two-year institutions, many public community colleges, and so forth. And so one way to conceptualize the problem we have in America in terms of the contribution of our higher education system as a whole to economic mobility is that there's a lack of dots in the upper right side. It kind of looks empty in the upper right side of this chart. We don't have that many colleges that both serve many low-income kids and deliver terrific outcomes. And so motivated by that reasoning, a very natural way to structure from an economist perspective what the issue looks like here and what the research agenda is How can we figure out how to move these dots to the right? And how can we figure out how to move these dots up? And so basically, we're thinking about those two dimensions. What I want to briefly show you is how in a recent study we released this summer, we've made some progress in thinking about those issues, particularly relevant to where we are today, and thinking about that first question of how we can move these dots that are up here to the right. So in thinking about that, the first question you might have is there really a capacity for institutions like ours to admit a more diverse student body? Or is it that there's so many disparities by the time you apply to college at age 18, kids from higher income families go to better schools, live in better neighborhoods, have better connections, and so on? Is that at that point, if you have a highly selective institution, maybe there's just no capacity to identify more talented low-income kids who would kind of meet the bar for admissions to Harvard and thrive at a place like this. So to get at that question, in our most recent study, what we did is took that data on where everyone's going to college and their parents' incomes and their own incomes and so forth, and linked in additional information, first on the SAT and ACT scores of everyone who's been applying to college in the past several years, and then data on internal admissions records from many colleges across America. And that allows us to draw this chart here, which I think is illuminating on that question of whether institutions like ours can make a difference on this margin, whether they're in a position to shift that dot to the right on the previous chart. So what we're doing here is plotting your chances. We're calling an Ivy Plus college. So the 8 Ivy League colleges and some peer highly selective private institutions like Stanford, Duke, MIT, and Chicago. And we're just saying, what are your chances of attending one of these colleges by parent income? Importantly, looking at kids, all of whom have exactly the same SAT or ACT scores. Students who scored exactly the 99th percentile on one of these entrance exams. In particular, that corresponds to an SAT score of 1510 out of 1600. So take the set of kids who get exactly 1510 out of 1600 on the SAT, ask what are your chances of showing up at one of these top private colleges in the United States. Turns out the answer, if you're from a middle-class family, is that about 10% of those very high-achieving kids, as measured by the SAT, show up at these colleges. Whereas if you're from a family in the top 1%, that number looks more like 30% or maybe even 40% at the very top of the income distribution. So that starts to suggest that even conditional on academic credentials at the point that you're applying to college, there are enormous differences in your prospects of attending one of these colleges, which maybe indicates that there might be something we could do in terms of identifying more talented kids, these kids who are doing really well on these standardized tests, even from middle income and low income families. Maybe we can get them to attend our colleges at higher rates, and that would effectively shift that dot to the right and increase Harvard's contribution to economic mobility. Now, one last step in thinking about what's happening here. So why is there this big uptick on the right? So using the detailed internal admissions data, we can start to uncover why this is happening. In the past, people have thought maybe this is about differences in the rate that people apply to different colleges or the rate of matriculation. It turns out the core thing is just about who gets in. It's just about admissions. Kids from high-income families are much more likely to be admitted to places like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, et cetera, conditional on having the same SAT scores as kids from lower-income families. Why is that? It turns out to be because of 3 factors: legacy admissions, athletic recruiting, and weight placed on non-academic credentials, things like extracurriculars and other kinds of factors that are different from academic qualifications, all of which end up being correlated with parental income and give you a significant advantage in admissions. So just to show you that very quickly, we are plotting here your chances of being admitted to an Ivy Plus college by legacy status, whether your parents went to that same college. And you can see that even controlling for test scores, if your parents went to one of these Ivy Plus colleges, you have a 45% chance of getting in particular, if your parents went to that college and are from the top 1% of the income distribution. The legacy advantage is actually smaller if your parents are not very rich. And then if you're a non-legacy, you're about 4 times less likely to get in with a 9.4% admissions rate. Now, in understanding this legacy advantage, people often wonder, is that, truly sort of unfair? And I'm sure Michael will have more to say about these kinds of issues. Or is it that maybe, the legacy students are more qualified on other dimensions that we're not able to measure well? Their parents went to institutions like Harvard and Stanford and so forth. So they must have been in families where they got a lot of education, et cetera, and maybe they're just more qualified applicants on other dimensions. So one way, just to show you the power of these kinds of data, you can test that explanation, is to ask, well, suppose your parents went to, say, Harvard. If you truly are a more qualified applicant, you might think your odds of getting into Stanford or Princeton are higher as well. So let's look at admissions decisions at other colleges. Turns out that's absolutely false. You have no higher chance of getting into any of these other Ivy League colleges if your parents were a legacy at a given college. So that starts to cast some doubt on whether that's actually what's going on. So you can do more analyses like this and start to show that you could really question whether that advantage for kids from high-income families makes sense in terms of being a meritocracy. Final point, why does this all matter? So by investigating these kinds of issues, like who is getting into these institutions, I think we can shift those dots to the right in that initial chart that I showed you. But you might react by saying, that's all well and good, but these top private colleges, in terms of total numbers, they educate a trivial share of the overall number of college students in the US. They're just not that big. Less than 1% of students in America attend one of these 12 Ivy Plus colleges. So in some sense, mechanically, you can't have an enormous impact on social mobility just by addressing problems like this. However, I want to end here by showing that that doesn't mean that this isn't a very important issue. And I'm going to show you that by turning to this final chart here, where in the first row, you see that it is indeed correct. Only 0.8% of students, college attendees, go to one of these 12 Ivy Plus colleges. However, these colleges play an incredibly disproportionate role in shaping the leadership of America, people in positions of influence. So if you look at the fraction of people in the top 1% or 0.1% of the income distribution who went to one of these colleges, 13% of people in the top 0.1% went to one of these 12 Ivy Plus colleges, even though they account for only 0.8% of college attendees as a whole. So in this, or if you look at Fortune 500 CEOs, a disproportionate share come from one of these handful of colleges. If you look at people who attend top graduate schools or are winners of prestigious awards like MacArthur grants, a remarkable 30% went to one of these 12 colleges. If you look at positions of political leadership, it's even more extreme. Look at the fraction of senators, journalists, Supreme Court justices, literally off the charts. 71% of Supreme Court justices went to one of these 12 colleges that educate just 0.8% of college attendees. And so we show in the paper that these colleges have a disproportionate effect on getting you to the very upper tail of society. There's a big causal effect of attending one of these colleges. And what that means is, when put together with the earlier data that I was showing you, essentially these colleges, perhaps inadvertently, are perpetuating privilege at the top, taking kids from very high income families and channeling them to positions of influence that then influence, and shape our laws, change companies, et cetera, having potentially a big impact on everyone else. And so that's the sense in which, among many other issues, I think thinking about how to democratize education in some sense can have a big impact on the United States. And I hope that, among other issues, will be things we talk about today. So
Great.
Over to you, Michael.
Great. Well done. Very good. I'll just pull this back because there are people who are now sitting behind us, so they can see a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Well, I want to say first of all what a pleasure it is to be in the company of two of the economists in all of the world whom I greatly admire. Dani Rodrik taught all of us, those who would listen, the follies of neoliberal globalization's excesses for 30, 40 years, and has now been vindicated and shown to be clairvoyant about the defects of what he's called hyper-globalization. And Raj Chetty has, in a way, vindicated economics from those who simply go around plugging in paradigms without actually doing fine-grained, in the case of Raj and his team Ingenious, empirical work of enormous normative significance And so, for example, we've learned from Raj and his team that despite generous financial aid policies, there are more students at Harvard and at Ivy League universities from the top 1% than from the entire bottom half of the country combined. We sort of sensed that, but didn't know that until Raj and his team did their work. And as far as higher education being an engine of upward mobility, which is a focus of Raj's work and the presentation, he's shown us actually what percentage of Harvard students come from low-income families, bottom fifth, and rise to affluence. And the figure is 1.8, which is shocking to most of us who are accustomed to thinking of higher education, at least as an engine of upward mobility. And not only that, beyond the Ivy League, he's shown that of 1,800 colleges and universities, public and private selected, the figure is about the same, 2% only of students arrive from low-income backgrounds and rise to the top fifth as adults. That's an astounding corrective to the complacent assumption that many people have that higher education is a powerful engine of upward mobility. So this is remarkable research. Here is my question for Raj. First a general question and then two more specific ones. The general question is this.
I thought I was the moderator here.
Well, you may still have to moderate us.
I'm getting worried here.
Is improving mobility an answer, the primary answer to inequality? I doubt it, but that's one question that I would like to put to Raj. Now, the two more particular questions. First, why is there such a frenzied competition to get in, to win admission to top colleges and universities? Now, it has something to do with the fact, surely, that the college wage premium has been growing very substantially in recent decades, almost doubled in the last few decades. So that's a partial explanation. But more than that, we have cast higher education, colleges and universities like this one, as arbiters of opportunity. That's the premise of the Opportunity Project. But should colleges and universities be arbiters of opportunity? Today, it's universities that confer the credentials and define the merit that a market-driven meritocratic society honors and rewards. But should it be? It isn't that way so much in other countries. It's not that way in Germany, where there is this frenzied competition to get into this university rather than that. It's not that way in Canada. There are other countries that are democratic and that have strong economies that don't cast higher education in that kind of role. So maybe here's the question I would begin with about mobility. Even if Harvard and Stanford admissions committees learned, as they should learn, from what you've shown us, and said, all right, that gives the lie to the complacent thought that if we admit more low and middle income students, that'll drag down the academic quality. You've shown that's not true. And suppose they acted on that insight and, let's say, got rid of legacy admissions. They'd have to get rid of other aspects, as the research also shows, because getting rid of legacies alone would not get far in this direction. It might also require, and Raj talks about athletic preferences, but even legacy in athletic doesn't get a long way, because there remains the advantage, the socioeconomic advantage embedded in SAT scores. So you'd have to think about SAT scores if you really want to make a dent. But suppose we could do that and have a reform project that would increase from 3 or 4% the number of students from the bottom fifth. Suppose that could be doubled or tripled. Moving a little bit closer to that upper right quadrant, maybe the mobility figure would rise from 1.8% to 3.6%, or 5%, or 7 or 8%. Still, would improved mobility in that range even begin to be an adequate answer, or a significant answer even, to people who are worried about wage stagnation, working people without a college degree? Those of us who spend our time in the company of the credentialed can easily forget the fact that most of our fellow citizens don't have a 4-year college degree of any kind. More than 60% do not. So even if we could tweak substantially these mobility figures at Ivy League plus places and beyond, is that really a significant improved mobility, even writ large? Would that be a significant answer to the inequality of income and wealth, and I would add social recognition and esteem that are dry hard?
Yeah, please, Raj, go ahead. So, I interpret the question as being sort of, so what happens to those who are left behind? What happens, can we take a whole of the economy kind of approach to this, and also worry about the esteem and dignity and recognition of those who, for whatever reason, even when you fix those problems of social mobility, those are, the 80% are still not going to be in the top 20%.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, let me thank Michael for engaging so much with economists in this context and his prior work, and really pushing the boundaries of our field to engage with these sorts of questions well beyond what we traditionally do in our discipline. So a couple of reactions come to mind. So first, I think I'm with you that in terms of fixing the problem of mobility in America, and let me defer for a second the question of whether mobility in and of itself should be what we focus on, or inequality of outcomes, but we can come back to that. But say you're interested in economic mobility, does focusing on these elite private institutions, as we've been doing in our recent study, is that really going to contribute? So here, I want to come back to the point I made at the end, that I think it's very important to distinguish between what we call upper tail mobility, your chances of reaching the very top of society, versus just going from the bottom fifth to the top fifth overall levels of social mobility. So I absolutely agree with your point that in terms of creating mobility overall, creating more dignity in work, helping a large number of folks, what we do at the small number of colleges just cannot be that important in the grand scheme of things. It's not going to, even if we get the overall mobility rate up to 4%, 5%, as you were saying, you're not going to see a fundamental change in that first picture I put up, what fraction of Americans are achieving the American dream in some sense. So why are we interested in what happens on these campuses? I would argue that it matters because, as I was showing in the very last chart, the people who are in positions of influence, who I think make decisions that then shape everyone else's lives, like what our laws look like how companies are run, which products are invented, which scientific problems are tackled. An enormous fraction of those people come from these institutions. And so what we show in our study is if Harvard had a more diverse student body, you end up with more diverse leadership in America. You would have a more diverse body of Supreme Court justices, senators, CEOs, leading scientists, et cetera. Why does that matter? There's other research that has shown that people's backgrounds tremendously influence the types of decisions they make in these sorts of positions. So for example, politicians who happen to have daughters rather than sons end up voting very differently down the road. Or there are other nice studies, some done by our former students here at Harvard, showing that if you have an experiment where you're randomly assigned in a dorm to live with somebody from a lower income family or somebody from a different background, and you look at what types of companies people start down the road or what types of patents they have, they tend to be focusing on inventing products that cater more to the problems of people from the middle class or lower income backgrounds. And so this is the sense in which I think downstream, there could be big impacts in inequality and the types of decisions that are made that do in fact affect many people's lives. Now, that all being said, I think Michael's right to emphasize, if you think back to that chart with all the dots, really where the action is in terms of directly increasing the impacts of the higher education system on mobility is to figure out what's going on the right side of that chart, or the people who are just not shown on that chart, the large fraction of Americans who simply don't go to any college. How do we increase opportunities, increase incomes, possibly increase the dignity of work for that large group of people? And here, independent of the focus on who gets admitted to Ivy League colleges, I think there are lots of things one can do in terms of having more effective educational programs. I'll give you one example. In the US, we tend to take kind of a liberal arts education approach throughout our education system, certainly institutions like this, but many other institutions across the spectrum. In many other countries, like you mentioned, Germany, for example, and many other European countries, there's more of a career-oriented or vocational sort of approach. And increasingly, there's good evidence that in the United States, programs that directly focus on giving people the skills needed to succeed in the modern economy are very effective in putting people on much more positive employment and earnings trajectories. To give you one concrete example, here in Boston, there's a program that was founded called Year Up, which some of you might know. It's a sectoral job training program that has been growing very rapidly in recent years. And in randomized trials, they show that if you get access to this one-year program, which is basically a program that provides you a certain set of technical skills, connects you with employers looking to hire for exactly those skills in finance, technology, et cetera, provides some mentoring and social support and so forth. People who get access to this program have a 35% increase in earnings, even if they didn't go to college, came from a disadvantaged background and so forth. So I think thinking carefully about those kinds of programs and making our community colleges more effective in equipping people with the skills needed to succeed in the modern economy, overcoming some of the challenges you've discussed, Dani, in your work, I think is an equally important approach. And I think we should be focusing on all of these things, not just what's happening on our campus here.
Yeah, I want to come back a little bit later to some of the remedies and the policies, but for now I want to ask a question to you, Michael, and taking off from a distinction you make in your book between distributive justice and what you call contributive justice. And distributive justice is the claim that each one of us has on society's resources. And contributive justice, I'm going to quote, is the opportunity to win the social recognition and esteem that go with producing what others need and value. Can you expand a little bit on this? And because I think it's sort of relevant also to this discussion.
And it bears on the broader question of the project, which is what is an economy for? And the traditional answer to that question is an economy is for the sake of consumption. Adam Smith said that explicitly. So did Keynes. The sole purpose and end of economic activity is consumption. And Smith said we should only concern ourselves with productive activities insofar as they bear on opportunities for consumption. And in contemporary economics, this goes under the banner of consumer welfare. Promoting consumer welfare, that's what GDP is a stand-in for. And then we debate how to distribute the fruits of consumption or of GDP. Contributive justice suggests that the size and distribution of the national product, important though they are not the only things that matter. And that's because the purpose of an economy, I mean, this is the argument that gives rise to a concern with contributive justice. The purpose of an economy is not only promoting consumer welfare and providing fair access to the fruits of consumption, it's also to create conditions hospitable to self-government. And that requires that we consider two aspects of our identities vis-a-vis the economy. Our role as consumers, we want lower prices as consumers, but also our role as producers, including the conditions under which we work and the social recognition and esteem that we receive when, through our work, we contribute to the economy and to the common good, when we meet the needs of others by providing valuable goods and services. The deep divide in our politics that we face today has partly to do, I think, with 5 decades of stagnant wages for middle and lower income workers and rising inequality of income and wealth, but only partly that. I think the anger and frustrations that roil our politics and have prompted the backlash have also to do with the divide, the growing divide between winners and losers, which is not exactly the same as the income and wealth divide, though it's related. The added element to the divide between winners and losers has to do with the attitudes towards success that accompanied the widening inequalities. The tendency of those on top to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and by implication, that those who struggle, those left behind, must deserve their fate too. And it's this way of thinking about success that contributes to the sense among many working people that elites are looking down on them, especially credentialed elites, college-educated elites, professional elites, the kinds of elites listed in the list of leaders on the slide that Raj showed us. And it's something like this is a plausible reading of what accounts for the deep frustrations that fuel the backlash against credentialed elites. I think it's worth being alive to the fact that the complaint is not only about access to consumption and unfairness in distribution. It's a complaint, and I think a legitimate complaint, about a sense that the work that a great many working people do is not valued, is not honored and recognized by the wider society. And this is the anger about being looked down upon. So it's not only about distribution, it's about recognition. Contributive justice, what are the conditions under which people can, through their work, contribute to the common good and be seen as making valuable contributions, even though the verdict of the labor market on the value of their contribution may suggest otherwise, and win honor and recognition for doing so. I think that's the crisis, the source, the deep source of the political crisis we face.
Raj, I'll ask you to reflect on what Michael just said, but I'm going to first remind you of something that you said in a podcast that I listened to in preparation for this.
Nothing is safe here. Right.
Oh, this will you will like this, Michael. So you were interviewed by Steve Levitt, and at one point you were discussing the importance of education for social mobility, and in particular, some of your work on the quality of teachers. And as Steve said, well, isn't this an argument for increasing sort of pay differentials? Pay the teachers who are doing a much better job, much higher. And then, of course, this is not possible because of teachers' unions and things like that. And then you said in your response that, but hold on, that might be one answer. And obviously, it's the first answer that occurs to an economist. But you said, think of an economy like Finland, where it's actually the recognition is conferred to teachers not by material incentives, but actually social status. And that the smartest kids in the classroom actually want to be teachers, and not because they think they're going to get a lot of money, which they want, but because a lot of social recognition and esteem attaches to that position. That you said, we're in a different equilibrium here in the United States. So it makes me think that you're actually, a lot of what Michael says resonates with you. But do you think in economics as in general, that we're terribly underemphasizing some of these, both what goes into the utility function in terms of losing a job is probably the worst thing that could happen to somebody, and that sort of has been validated in a lot of surveys and so forth. And yet, as Michael said, it's all of this. That's not directly the only effect that shows up in the way we think about consumers is what it does directly to their income and their consumption possibilities, not the much larger loss in terms of social recognition. So does this focus on work, social recognition, status, esteem? Is this something that we're really completely neglecting that we should make for?
Yeah. No, these are all great points. So Michael mentioned Keynes, and at some level, at a macro level, you can kind of see the way economists were conceptualizing this historically and have continued to, and why I think that was wrong. So some of you might know a famous quote from Keynes that in 100 years or so, or predicting, basically around this time, nobody would be working because we'd be so rich, no one would need to work. If you took the traditional economic model that there's disutility of labor, the only reason you work is to generate consumption, diminishing marginal utility of consumption, at some point you get satiated, nobody wants to work anymore. So that was clearly completely wrong. People still work quite a bit. And that is a rough piece of evidence that things along the lines of what Michael's suggesting, that there's something meaningful about work that matters to people, independent of purely generating consumption, that might be going on. And certainly when you look at a more micro level and think about the decisions that people make in terms of career and what outcomes you see afterward in terms of satisfaction or health, the recent literature on deaths of despair and mortality, a lot of that seems to be associated with things like dignity of work, social status, social connections, how people are recognized. And so I absolutely think that as a discipline, that narrow and convenient, and to be fair, I think powerful conception of income and monetary rewards as a key driver, incentives as being a key driver of what people do, it does miss important parts of decision-making, and I think can lead us down paths that ultimately don't have as much inclusion as we could in our economy if we considered these factors. Now, I think the tricky thing in terms of how we then move to policy solutions, if we recognize these issues, is how do you actually achieve the equilibrium in Finland? Maybe it is true that social status is incredibly important. The nice thing in a way, if it was just about incentives, is you can have a well-defined debate about how teachers get paid and should you have more incentive pay and how do you raise the resources to pay teachers at a higher level and so on. But if it's about social status, I think we understand much less about how you change that equilibrium. Or is it even possible to change that equilibrium through policy, or does that just somehow emerge endogenously? And so I think, for the many students here in the audience, those are very interesting and important issues to think about, and that would help us create a new generation of economics that includes some of these other important factors.
So this is where I think, Michael, maybe you can give us an answer, because if markets and market prices are not going to be our yardstick for value, and other things like social recognition, esteem, and if those are going to be determined somehow through public deliberation and different conception of civic virtue. So what does that actually mean in practice? How do we get closer to a society like that?
Well, first, it requires that we question an assumption into which all of us too easily slide. And that's the assumption that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. Now, a moment's reflection suggests that most of us don't really believe that, even though we often assume that. Because if we did, we would insist that the value of the contribution of a hedge fund manager really is 2,000 or 3,000 times greater than the value of the contribution of a nurse or a school teacher, or for that matter, a doctor. Even vigorous defenders of laissez-faire free market economics would be hard-pressed to make that claim, which suggests that on reflection, the verdict of the market on the value of people's respective contributions to the economy and the common good is deeply misleading, which suggests that we as democratic citizens need to find a way somehow to reclaim from markets. What we've done, especially in the last 4 decades, is we've outsourced our moral judgment about value, what counts as a valuable contribution, to markets. And it's tempting to do that, not just because markets deliver the goods and affluence and prosperity. It's tempting to do that because markets seem to be a value-neutral instrument to decide messy, contested questions that otherwise we as democratic citizens would have to think through and argue through and debate and disagree about ourselves. And in pluralist societies, we think that's a recipe for conflict, for disagreement, maybe even for the majority imposing its values on those who disagree. And so we lean on markets as if they were value-neutral ways of deciding fundamental questions about the value of contributions for us. So what would it mean to reclaim for public deliberation questions about the value of various jobs? We can glimpse one small, fleeting, concrete example, if we recall the way we thought and spoke about this during the pandemic, when those of us who had the luxury of working from home couldn't help but recognize how deeply we depend on workers we often overlook. Delivery workers, warehouse workers, grocery store clerks, home healthcare workers, nurse assistants, truck drivers. These are not the best paid or the most honored workers in our society. But during the pandemic, for a moment, we were calling them essential workers and we were putting up signs thanking them, and we were sometimes even applauding them at the end of the day. It could have been a moment for a broader public debate about how to bring their pay and recognition into better alignment with the importance of their work. But alas, the pandemic receded and that debate never really happened. But I think that the starting point is to seize on moments of shared recognition, like that moment, to ask about wage policies, to ask about forms of investment, to ask about tax policies that prompt public debate about this question. Let me give one example. Suppose we had a debate from this point of view, from the point of view of contributive, not only distributive justice, about why it is that we tax earnings from labor at a higher rate than we tax earnings from dividends, interest, and capital gains. Now, we sometimes argue about that from the standpoint of fairness and who can best bear the burden of taxation. That's about distributive justice, and it's important. But suppose we had that debate also from the standpoint of contributive justice and asked whether we should treat earnings differentially in this way. And here's another quick example of a concrete question that might provoke or could provoke that kind of broader debate. The payroll tax is a tax on labor. It's a regressive tax. Suppose we considered a proposal to eliminate the payroll tax, or at least to eliminate the workers' share of the payroll tax, and to replace the lost revenue through some version of a Tobin tax, a tax on speculative financial activities. Now, here again, we might have that debate from the standpoint of fairness and who is best able to bear the burden of taxation. But we could also have that debate by asking whether speculative financial activity, especially financial activity that doesn't constitute investment or the direction of capital to the real economy, to socially useful activities in the real economy, is valuable enough to the economy and the common good. One could argue whether it's valuable at all, and some people have called that into question, but valuable enough to, by which I mean speculation and not investment in bridges and roads and schools and hospitals and new companies, but the kind of finance that involves speculating on the future assets of already existing assets, real or synthetic. Does that really contribute to the economy and to the common good? And if so, does it contribute anything like the value that the current system of pay, but also after-tax pay would reflect? That would be another way of surfacing up the question of contributive justice, the debate, a public debate about what activities, what economic activities really do constitute valuable contributions to the economy and to the common good.
Want to comment just on that?
Yeah, Dani, can I just jump in? You know, everything Michael said, I think, highlights the complexities in valuing people's contributions, and that's extremely important. I want us to qualify a little bit and think about, we've been focusing on the limitations of markets in valuing contributions, and certainly there are many. But I think it's also important to remember that non-market solutions can themselves have some limitations that are worth bearing in mind. So take the example of teachers that you gave earlier. If you look in the United States and look at cases where teacher pay is determined by governments, and many wages in our economy are determined by governments rather than market forces, even the United States, because of the size of government, you will find that teachers in public schools are often, in many cases, paid less than teachers whose wages are effectively set by the private market to some extent, who are teaching in private schools or charter schools that face less regulations and so forth. And so that's a case where arguably the market is actually valuing these folks' contributions, which I think many of us in this room would agree are incredibly valuable and should not be valued 3,000 times less than a hedge fund manager. The market's actually valuing those contributions more than the way we're effectively valuing them through our public systems. And so I think that's very important to keep in mind as we think about solutions that, it's not that necessarily the market's getting it right there, but when we deviate from the market, it's not obvious that we're going to move in the right direction. So I think that's something important to think about. One other point to add is that, of course, market wages are determined in equilibrium by both demand, but also by supply. And so I think this ties back to some of the issues of education that we discussed, where we focused on how many people are getting college degrees and what kinds of forces might help them versus non-educated workers who don't go to college. But those things are linked. So if more people go to college and attend higher quality colleges, there are going to be fewer people competing for jobs like delivering groceries or driving Uber and things like that. And that's going to, through market forces, naturally drive up those wages. And so I think in equilibrium, if we're going to live in a market economy, we've got to recognize that all of these things are connected. And I think it's very important to think about how we qualify what the market equilibrium delivers, but also recognize the powerful market forces that are at play and try to think about how, say, increasing access to education may actually ultimately benefit those who are not getting that education because there's less competition among those folks who are left out.
Michael, you want?
Could I just add to that? I agree in general terms, Raj, with that observation, but I would just, I think it's worth bearing in mind that what counts as the market equilibrium and what counts as pay determined by governments, as in the teacher case, can often obscure the way rules are written before markets do their work in allocating pay to various roles. To go back to the example of finance, are the earnings of people who work on Wall Street. Now, that's not pay determined by government, it seems. It's pay determined by their companies. And yet, the government set the rules, for example, on carried interest. The government set the rules on interest paid by companies being tax deductible. The government set the rules permitting rather than prohibiting stock buybacks. Now, bearing all of those, that rulemaking that goes into creating what seems on the surface to be a market equilibrium where pay is not determined by governments but by firms, wouldn't you agree that government has its hand in shaping the conditions that give rise to the market equilibria that generate the pay in the first place?
Yes, I mean, no doubt it's true that the market equilibrium that emerges is a function of various choices we've made in government. But I would argue that even in the cases where government's directly shaping pay, it's not obvious that in our political equilibrium, we're ending up in a place where people are being valued at their true social contribution. So I think we need to examine why that's happening in the case of teachers, in the case of many other people employed by the government, in adjacency to the issues I think you're raising, Michael.
Before I turn to the audience for some questions, I want to just ask you one final question, Raj, to say a little bit more about some remedies. You've talked about education. Michael has brought in questions about tax policy and different choices that we make as to who we tax. But I want you to say a little bit about your work on what you've called economic connectedness, the importance of place and how different locations and communities differ in the opportunities they provide in terms of allowing for connections across socioeconomic groups, because that also would have some implications for policy that go beyond education as well. So if you can just tell us a little bit about that work.
Yeah, absolutely. So similar to the work we've done looking at economic opportunity and mobility for every college in America, in other parts of our research, we've examined how economic mobility varies across neighborhoods in America, depending upon where you grow up. And we find there are tremendous differences in children's chances of rising up across different areas in different cities. It turns out in the US, in the rural Midwest, for example, if you take a child born to a family, say at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, they're very likely to reach the middle class or beyond. Whereas if you look at the child born at the exact same income level in a place like Charlotte, North Carolina, or in many other cities in the United States, they may not even be doing better than their parents on average. So opportunity varies greatly across cities. And it turns out actually to vary greatly even within cities. So if you look in Boston at people growing up in Dorchester or Roxbury versus in the western suburbs, versus in places like Revere and Everett, there are very different chances of rising up. And so we've had a research program along with many other social scientists trying to understand what the origins are of these differences in economic opportunity. And as Dani highlights, one of the key factors we and others have uncovered as being a key determinant of these differences in mobility is social capital. And that echoes some of the work of Bob Putnam here at the Kennedy School, where one particular form of social capital, the degree of cross-class interaction, which we measure using Facebook data, the number of high-income friends that low-income people have, and we're able to measure that zip code by zip code, again, using sort of a big data approach. That is an incredibly strong predictor of differences in economic mobility and turns out to be the strongest predictor anyone has identified to date. Why is that? We're trying to understand, why you find that tight connection. It could be because networks create opportunities for job referrals. The vast majority of jobs that people get in the US are through referrals. It could be that aspirations are shaped by who you're connected to. If you've never met anyone who went to college, maybe applying to college, let alone a place like Harvard, is just not on your radar screen. And that completely changes people's trajectories. And so in a series of papers, we and others, I think, are increasingly finding that this sort of mechanism is extremely important in shaping economic mobility, both at the neighborhood level and I suspect also likely at the college level. Some of the data that we've been looking at here, as much as we'd like to think that the great treatment effects of attending Harvard are driven by our great professors here at Harvard, I think a lot of it is probably about who you get connected to and the networks you form and so forth. And so that mechanism is extremely important. So why does that matter for policy? When you have that view of the world, you might then think about how you create more integration, how you connect people from different backgrounds through residential desegregation, through programs that might bring different types of people into contact with each other. There are many different things to explore, and I think that's an interesting area for further policy intervention, for further work. Let me make one final point that connects this back to some of the conversation we've been having earlier. I find, Dani, that this granular data on how your odds of success vary greatly depending upon where you grew up is actually a great way to counter the narrative you described, Michael, that can be very corrosive, where people feel like, I made it to the top of the distribution, it's totally my own doing. You didn't make it, you must not be, you don't have as much merit, you're not as qualified. Actually, the first exercise I have students do in a large undergraduate class I teach here at Harvard called Using Big Data to Solve Social Problems, Sanders Theater, is to have students take the Opportunity Atlas data, publicly accessible, type in your zip code. Now imagine you grew up 2 miles down the road. How do you think, based on the research we're discussing, your life would have been different? Would you actually be sitting here in Sanders Theater? The answer typically is no. Your odds of success would be dramatically different. That is, I think, a way to show people how much, yes, hard work matters greatly, but your circumstances matter greatly as well. And I think that kind of approach can be very helpful in contextualizing.
And this Dani, is one of the many reasons that, although I'm gently giving Raj a hard time, this work is enormously important and enormously impressive. And
the way that it connects with your work, Michael, is that, so if I understand it correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's not an individual's own connections that you're examining, because you actually don't know that. You're just looking at the average level of connections in the community in which an individual grew up. So it's, in that sense, it's just a sort of a community contribution that's not so that's it's very interesting. So let's see if we can have some questions. I can see from the number of hands. I may try to group some questions if they are sort of unrelated. So let's start over here. I'm going to try to go from one side to another. So
thank you very much. My name is Emil.
If you can be short, please.
Absolutely. Kudos first to the person who decided to bring the three of you on stage together. Raj, you mentioned Keynes' paper, I think it's called The Possibilities of Our Grandchildren. Looks 100 years down, writes it in the middle of the Depression, and writes this burst of optimism. If you were to write your Possibilities of Grandchildren paper, maybe just looking 50 years ahead, but anyway, daring you to think about, like, what would be the main ideas of that paper? What would be your Possibilities of Grandchildren paper? And this is actually to the three of you, so whoever
I
wants
was
to
going
jump
to say
on
a better question for Michael, who thinks, and Dani, then.
So maybe let's take another question while Michael thinks, and maybe you'll have.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment, but yes.
So let me take one question from here. Yes. Yep. Over in this table. Yeah. Sorry.
Michael Sandel, visiting PhD fellow at MIT Sloan. I was wondering what do the recent changes in affirmative action regulation in the US how do they affect the dynamics?
What regulation?
Affirmative action for college admission, how do affect all these dynamics you were discussing? Thank you.
Yeah, so you want to answer that question specifically? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, and I can comment a bit on both. It'd be
Yep.
great to get Michael's reactions as well. So on the affirmative action decision, of course, limiting the use of race in college admissions. So what consequences does that have, and how does that interact with some of what we've been talking about here? So, that's of course going to impact a different form of diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, and our best evidence from prior bans on affirmative action, for example, in California, when that happened there back in the 90s, is that this is going to have an impact on racial diversity, even in equilibrium, as colleges look for other measures that might, think about identifying diversity in other ways. Now, in our work and a lot of our conversation today is focused on a related dimension, socioeconomic diversity, correlated with race, of course, but not exactly the same. Simplest way to think about that is most low-income people in America are white, not Black. So even if you think more about putting weight on socioeconomic diversity, you're never going to get to the same place in terms of racial diversity. Now, one thing that I think is interesting that's come out of the Supreme Court decision is colleges have been forced to reevaluate how they do admissions. We put out our paper that I briefly described here a couple of weeks after that decision. And because colleges have been forced to revisit admissions by race, it's also a great time to revisit admissions by class, to think about legacy issues and other related issues. And I suspect a lot of that is going to happen going forward. One interesting pattern we're seeing as we talk with college presidents and administrators around the US is a focus on identifying other measures of adversity that maybe get to the core of what we care about. And it'd be interesting to get Michael's perspective on this, on just what seems fair in the process of admission. So I'll give you one concrete example. Yale University just announced that they are going to use that opportunity atlas data that I was just describing on how kids' chances of rising up vary across different neighborhoods in their admissions process. Basically, they're going to say, if you came from a neighborhood where historically very few kids have risen up, we're going to give you a bit of an advantage for overcoming adversity, getting to the same place in the admissions process relative to kids who didn't have to overcome that. Because opportunity in America is greatly correlated with race, Black people tend to live in communities that have lower rates of upward mobility. That is going to have the effect, incidentally, of creating more racial diversity as well. And so I think colleges are going to look to tools like this. Let me briefly comment on the initial question on 50 years from now. I don't like to make predictions, partly because I suspect I will also be wrong. And so don't want to repeat Keynes's mistake in some sense. But what I would hope for is a society where I think over the past 50 or 100 years, we've developed this capitalistic engine based on basic principles in economics that in some ways have been incredibly powerful and successful in generating innovation, high levels of overall growth, and so on, but have clearly been incredibly unequal and non-inclusive. And my hope is, partly through conversations like this, research that people are doing, we will have a system that is producing more equitable rewards, creating more opportunity, and harnessing more talent in a more effective way 50 years from now.
So to address that question, I like Raj's answer to the affirmative action question. I hope, I don't know whether I predict, but I hope that 50 years from now, or maybe sooner, we will be more inclined to question or to ask the question, what features of the economy we should take as fixed, and what features we should view as subject to contestation and debate. The discussion we had about whether the labor market is an accurate verdict on the value of contributions is one such example. I would give two other quick examples of this. The first goes back to this question of the frenzied competition to get into top universities in the United States. And this is partly because the college wage premium has more or less doubled in recent decades. Now, one way of viewing that development is to say it's simply the way things are in a highly technological society. There is a greater need for highly skilled workers, and that's why the college premium has increased. It's an exogenous variable. It's a fact of nature that we have simply to adapt to, maybe through redistributive policies. Or it could be viewed in another way. Consider this analogy. If over the last 40 years, the pay gap between men and women doubled, we would consider that a problem and be debating how to fix it. Or if the pay gap for the last 40 years between white workers and African-American workers substantially increased, we would consider that a problem and debate how to fix it. Question: should we regard the doubling of the college wage premium in that way, or as a fact of life in a knowledge economy? That's an example of what I mean about questioning what we take as fixed in the economy and what we take as contestable. The other example goes to what I learned from Dani Rodrik back when he was saying that the finance-driven version of neoliberal globalization was not the only way of conceiving or enacting globalization. But the politicians in particular, now put aside the economists, the politicians who celebrated that version of globalization presented it as a fact of nature to which we just had to adapt. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to college. What you earn will depend on what you learn. These were the mantras. This was the bracing advice that politicians gave in how to respond to what seemed to be, as they presented it, a fact of nature. Bill Clinton spoke of the globalization of the economy is like water running downhill. And Tony Blair described it. He said, there are some who say we should stop and debate globalization, but we may as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. Well, here's an example of how already we've seen a change in what we take as fixed and what we take as contestable. Because now looking back on Bill Clinton and Tony Blair's account of the inevitability of globalization, as like the changing of the seasons, it was smug at the time, but it now seems quaint, this analogy to the seasons, because climate change has reconfigured the seasons. Summer is hotter and lasting longer. Some scientists predict that absent changes in the way we live, in 50 years, summer will last for half the year. So what's possible, the line between what's possible and what's necessary shifts beneath our feet. And today, and certainly, I hope 50 years from now, we will have to find ourselves figuring out how to debate and to decide whether autumn should follow summer.
Michael, do you like the example that Raj gave of universities using the Opportunity Atlas to give those applicants from communities where there is less upward mobility, given legs up in the application process?
Yes. I mean, I have this broader reservation about the extent to which we should focus mainly on mobility rather than equality. But putting that broader concern aside, which is a longer discussion, I think that's a good thing. I also think it's a good thing that universities ask a similar question about first-generation applicants and attend to that aspect of admission. But yes.
I wonder though if this becomes common, the future Supreme Court would basically knock it down, saying that you can't use the attributes of a group because it's not the individual has overcome adversity, but it's just an average. But it's an interesting question. Let's a couple more questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Vaibhav. I'm an MPID 1 from India. Thank you so much for the talk. My question's to Raj. You talked about making education more vocational and slightly more career focused in some ways, but I was wondering if this does not sort of risk, pivoting people towards certain kinds of careers, and more importantly, like who's making the decisions about what these career goals and what these specific aspects of these vocational based educational institutions should be.
Take another question from yes.
Hi, I'm Benti from the MPID 2. Actually quite related to that, I imagine there would be substantial fiscal pressures, not only to bring people to these new frontiers of skills and technology, but to bring people and citizens there en masse to ensure that there's continued uplift from poverty, social mobility, and overcoming inequality. So I wonder if your findings and the broader discussion can point to any new or alternative models of education that could ensure we have the capacity to continue training people in depth and also quickly to ensure that they have the skills to ensure our continued economic growth, especially with more advanced manufacturing and services jobs now.
Since both questions were on education, if there are other education-related questions, might as well. So here's, yeah.
Hi, I am Kailash from Nepal and MPID. So my question regarding what Professor Sandel mentioned on contributive justice and your topic regarding socioeconomic mobility, how could universities then now reimagine their curriculum, not only in terms of promoting socioeconomic mobility, but also maybe to improve the sort of appreciation or intrinsic value for all work? Like, is it a function of the school system or is it just a function of the markets later on?
Okay, who wants to start?
One way, well, here's one way I would change our system of higher education. I think we should consider and discuss and debate how we might reverse the steep hierarchy of prestige that between the Ivy Plus and other selective colleges and universities and other institutions of learning in the United States. I think we, with the possible exception of Britain, have created such a hierarchy of prestige that it not only leads to unfairness for those who don't get in and who don't get a four-year degree, and that's most people. But it also, I think, does damage to the winners because the price they pay, the price we pay for this anxiety-packed, highly pressurized meritocratic tournament is that we convert the adolescent years of our young people into a kind of battlefield of credentializing that isn't good for them, and such that by the time they arrive, we have so ingrained in them the imperatives to network and gather credentials and jump through hoops and to see their education instrumentally, that the undergraduate years, it becomes hard to preserve the what an undergraduate education should be, a time to reflect about what's worth caring about and why. There's very little space for that. If once you arrive here, well, if colleges and universities become, as I fear they have become, basic training in applying for stuff. And so I think that's one reason, beyond questions of fairness and our citizens who are left behind. It's also corrosive of the intrinsic purpose of higher education. I worry that the heavy emphasis on credentializing and networking is crowding out our educational mission. So although the cultural significance and centrality and prestige, and maybe also the endowments of these now strategic, socially strategic institutions loom very large, it isn't good for education, never mind for fairness. So this is one of the ways I think we need to rethink what we're doing and the way we've conscripted higher education into the frenzied, anxiety-strewn, but wounding battlefield of merit.
I can briefly jump in. Michael very nicely addressed the last question. I'll briefly touch upon the first two questions that were asked. So, you had raised the issue of whether vocational training runs the danger of, who chooses which skills are provided. I think that kind of question is especially relevant in this very dynamic economy where new technologies, things like AI, are disrupting many industries. The danger, I think, of vocational career-oriented education is that you get trained in a skill set that seems relevant today, but 10 years from now, that narrow thing is no longer relevant. And because you don't have that broader, more versatile skill base, now there's no longer a payoff. So I think that's absolutely a consideration to keep in mind. And that's, in some sense, the defense of the more broad liberal arts sort of education that could help you pursue various paths. That being said, I would note a couple of things. So first, in these programs that show very large impacts, like I was discussing Year Up, for example, or other sectoral job training programs, you should not think of this as the margin of people picking career A versus career B, but often people on the margin of just non-employment, just having really no career prospects in many cases, and now they've been put on a stable employment trajectory that at least gives them a foothold in the economy, and maybe they get some on-the-job skills and are on a productive, dignified path. And so from that perspective, I'm less concerned about that kind of issue. I think the deeper concern relates to the other question is about the scalability of this sort of education and thinking about fiscal pressures in particular, particularly at a time when many states are cutting back on the amount spent on education. I think that's an extremely important issue. And thinking about how we preserve political support for funding education in a way that can create opportunities for a lot more people. And coming back to what I was saying earlier about the supply side pressures, reducing the number of people competing for jobs that do not require those college degrees. And so I think showing the value of certain types of education very clearly and generating more support for that sort of funding would be valuable. And B, figuring out more cost-effective models for effective education is extremely important, because the fact is, no matter what we think the impacts of a Harvard-type education are, it's just way too expensive to be the type of educational product that's going to be scaled. And so I think we need to figure out how to have scalable, highly effective systems of education, which, related to that first chart with all the dots I showed, basically, we haven't quite figured out yet in the US.
Could I just add a quick word of support to what Raj has said? Isabel Sawhill at the Brookings Institutes about 6 years ago did a study about federal support for different kinds of education. And she found that the federal government invests, several years ago, in helping students attend higher education, $162 billion a year. And the amount the federal government spends on vocational and technical training, 1.1 billion, 162 to 1.1, which reflects, I think, not only the funding problem, but a funding problem that in turn is an expression of the credentialist tilt to the way we think about contribution.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yes, over there.
Hi, thank you for such an interesting discussion. And you mentioned your idea of contributional justice hinges upon, contribution to the society, the common good. But how do you define what the common good is? What is good and what is bad contribution? What kinds of jobs are good or bad? Because, for example, a blue collar worker in the US might be earning more than a blue collar worker in India or any other developing part of the world. So how do we bring it to like an equal level?
Right. Like at the back over there. One more.
Yeah, so Yotam Sofer, visiting PhD student, HBS. A question to Raj about you showed the slide with basically the demise of the American dream. Do you have the time dimension also for the role of higher education, Ivy League plus institutions? Do they change their role as well in the society? And I guess more of a political economy question. So if it's a way for elites to reproduce themselves and keep their kind of privilege, how difficult will it be to change that? And I guess affirmative action is a good case of elites kind of saying, no, don't touch it, right?
Hello, thanks all. I'm an economist in King's College and a visiting faculty in government here. So I would like to reflect a bit on opportunity and mobility. If I were to rephrase the point that Professor Sandel said on mobility by Dani's words, would be like, it's not maybe the most binding constraint for democratization or equality. But if mobility is not the most binding constraint, then what's the most binding constraint? Isn't it the influence of the elites? What is the role of Harvard to redistribute opportunity? What is the role of Harvard to set the tone of a debate about the sequencing of seasons? Why is the role of the elite to say what type of, should we just preoccupy ourselves with diminishing the influence of those elites in general in political debate, as opposed to like micro-fixing, second order derivatives into improving policy here and there, which is very iconoclastic for an economist as myself, but maybe that's the issue we should be addressing.
Take one final question and then you'll have the last word.
Thank you. Mine builds on the question of the definition of the common good. I was struck by the discussions around justice, fairness, and notions of what we value. And I'm just curious, as we think about defining these things, do we need to come to consensus about this? And if so, how do we begin to think about arriving at consensus in defining some of these topics in a pluralistic society? And I mean, especially one today that is just so divided. And you had mentioned, Mr. Sandel, the need for more public deliberation. Where do we even begin to have those conversations? And are there limits to scalability in terms of who's included in those conversations and how we should approach them?
Michael, you have 30 seconds to define for us the common good and get us all to agree.
And this is it?
We'll have another one in a few months.
Well, one way of, it's true we live in pluralist societies. And it's also true that that complicates the project of deliberating as citizens about the common good, or for that matter, about justice, or the role and reach of markets, or what we owe one another as fellow citizens. These are all contestable questions. But the real question is whether, if you believe in democracy, you think that we must shrink from disagreement about values. There's a powerful tendency that we have to do just that, to think that our public life will be less contentious, less clamorous, less polarized if we ask people to leave their moral and spiritual convictions outside when they enter the public square. But the problem with that solution, though it seems to be a way toward a more tolerant society, we don't want to mix it up about our competing values or conceptions of the common good. The problem with that society is that it leads to a morally empty public square. It leads to a vacuum, a hollow public discourse that consists either of narrow managerial technocratic talk, which inspires no one, or when passion enters, we have shouting matches, partisan shouting matches and ideological food fights on talk radio and on social media, and for that matter, on the floors of Congress. And this is what we're doing now. So we've got plenty of polarization now. We have plenty of trouble reaching consensus on anything now. So the question is whether, as I propose, we would have a healthier democratic life if we welcomed into the public square competing conceptions of what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good, what counts as a just distribution of income and wealth and power and opportunity. If we had a morally more robust kind of public debate, recognizing that it will be messy and contentious and controversial, but also acknowledging that the alternative of trying to create a kind of morally neutral public square simply, well, it does one of two things. It relegates these questions to markets which seem to be neutral, but we all know are not value neutral ways of allocating goods or determining investment or setting pay. They're not. The other problem with trying to keep moral argument about the common good out of public debate is that sooner or later, where there is a vacuum of larger public meaning and purpose, that space will be filled. And when it's filled, it will be filled by narrow, intolerant moralisms, typically coming from either fundamentalism or hypernationalism. And that's exactly what's happened in the aftermath of 4 decades of a market-driven attempt to seek a kind of neutral public space where the economy and the imperatives, the necessities of globalization were seen to be fixed by nature and therefore open to be determined by the experts, a kind of technocracy. That created such an empty, hollow public discourse and public space that sadly, it's been largely filled by the harshest, most intolerant voices seeking to fill it, which has landed us with the polarized condition we face today.
I can just add one final point to what Michael said on how to create this informed public debate, which I absolutely agree, is a key to addressing some of these problems going forward. I think being transparent about the challenges we face by measuring very clearly how opportunity and inequality vary by circumstances across colleges, as we've been focusing on today, across neighborhoods, across schools, by race, by ethnicity, bringing facts to bear to anchor these sorts of discussions, even if people may bring different values, to combine with that sort of data can be very valuable. And we're now in a position in the social sciences to be able to do this systematically. And my hope is we can continue to build on that going forward to have a more informed public discourse in the years to come.
Which is why I love your kind of social science.
Well, this has been, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much, Raj. Thank you, Michael.